Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we are going to have an introduction into the data management technology and tools. The abundance of data in today's business world has created a really crowded digital place for most companies. Hence, the proper access to the right and the clean data is becoming very essential to be able to extract the business value needed. So today we are going to explore how can Talend help us to achieve the needed clarity from this data chaos. Let me first introduce Talend team. We have on board Brian, sales manager for the Middle East and Africa, and Luca, expert solution engineer. Okay, Brian, we can see your screen and you can start. Brian? Brian, are you hearing me? Brian, Luca?
Yeah, sorry, we're just took mute. So hopefully you can see my screen, yeah?
Currently, it's a white page. There is nothing. We have already seen the presentation, but then it disappeared.
Okay, try one more time. Is that any better?
Yes, now we can see the slide.
Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction. There's two sort of precious commodities here that we're going to talk about. One of them is your time and everybody's time. And the objective here is really to try and get as much useful information across to you as possible. And really the theme of this presentation, which is a common theme that we're seeing globally, which is both an opportunity and also a threat to a lot of organizations, is data and creating value from data. And there's all sorts of buzzwords around data is the new oil or the new gold, etc., etc. But this isn't really about data. This is really about information. And the challenge that all organizations have, whether they're for-profit organizations or not-for-profit organizations, is that data value is something that everybody's pursuing. So, as I say, we've got a very short schedule, and the objective is really to try and get as much useful content across to you as possible. I don't really want to talk too much about the product. Luca will do a demonstration based on a product that is called Data Fabric. And Talend, just as a very quick introduction, is a US-based company that is essentially focused on data management. Now, the reason I sort of call out being US-based is that the key factor in the industry today is that most of the technology innovation that we're seeing is coming from West Coast US. We don't see a lot of innovation coming out of Europe. We don't see a lot of innovation coming out of China still, or Asia. But the key thing, not only is the US a hub of technology, and it's the technology that's driving innovation and digital strategies, etc., but in the US is very, very good at monetizing technology. And it's not surprising then if we look at the growth of global companies that are really starting to dominate, both in terms of infrastructure and use cases and applications of data. These guys are getting bigger and dominating more. And obviously we're talking about not just organizations like Uber, Airbnb, Facebook, Amazon, etc. So Talend was actually a French company, and it moved its roots to the US primarily for that reason, and also because it became a public company and moved to NASDAQ. And the key thing, the key ingredient is that if you're a technology vendor and if you're based in the US, there's a lot of access to venture capital, and it's venture capital that's driving the innovation that we're seeing today. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight. And Everteam is a Talend partner that exclusively and we've worked on many projects with them. So we've got quite a lot of hands-on experience partnering with Everteam and the associated companies. So again, at a very high level, we talk about data chaos, and this is a little bit of a tagline, and it probably doesn't mean a lot to everybody. But in essence, what we're talking about here is that data is growing, and everybody understands that. We can see the growth in data, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what a lot of people are missing is that when we talk about data, and from a Talend perspective, our definition of data goes down to ones and zeros. So when we talk about digitalization, when we talk about organizations and countries that are pursuing digital strategies, it's important, I think, at this stage to clarify that when we talk about data, we're not just talking about structured data. We're not just talking about files and databases. We're talking about unstructured data. We're talking about data that is video. We're talking about data that's IoT. We're talking about data that's audio. We're talking about data that is weblogs. So it's interesting now that if I look right the way across the Middle East, and it's true right the way across GCC, Egypt, et cetera, we still see a lot of organizations that are still very focused and very dependent on data warehousing and business intelligence. And these are important to a degree, but at best they can probably give what I call a rear view indication of where the business is. Because typically when you talk about data warehousing and business intelligence, there's two things that are key. One of them is that you're really relying on your own data. And secondly, that data is typically historic. And I sort of use the analogy of driving a car. It's a little bit like driving a car looking in the rear view mirror. And data now, for most organizations, has moved away from the traditional BI and analytics, where data becomes business critical, where you're running KPIs, where you're looking at forecasting and prediction. Data for most organizations now has moved to mission critical, where the business decisions of that organization are conducted real time, near real time. And if we take that concept to the highest level, where data suddenly becomes life critical, then data becomes very strategic and very important, because the consequences of getting it wrong are quite severe. And the important thing there is that in the past, when people were looking at data warehousing and business intelligence, most, if not all, IT organizations were buying tools and point products. They were buying a product for integration. They were buying a product for data quality. They were buying a product for running ESB, et cetera, et cetera. But this comes with a price. And the price for a lot of organizations is that for every tool that you acquire, you end up with an overhead from an IT ops perspective. And as data becomes mission critical, as it moves to life critical, then uptime and availability suddenly become key components. And when we look at reducing the complexity of ownership, looking at continuous integration, continuous deployment is something that all IT organizations have to pursue. And if we take that concept to the extreme, and the advance of technology that's underpinning and enabling digital strategies is moving faster and faster towards the cloud. And as we move towards the cloud, then the adoption of software as a service type solutions also become critical, and also almost the standard now in terms of architectures and products that customers have access to and customers can deploy. So what does that really mean? So again, if I look to the future, I sort of always look a little bit to the West, and I look at successful organizations that have deployed digital strategies, and probably more importantly, have the required IT infrastructure to be able to process not batch information where they're running a job out of hours in the evening, but organizations that can process and can access millions of bytes of information or millions of bits of information and actually extract business knowledge and be in a position to make business decisions based not just on traditional analytics or advanced analytics, but certainly when we look at the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which suddenly becomes key to be able to process masses of data of all types of data structures, whether it's on databases or data streams, etc. Technology suddenly becomes an overriding and key component to any digital strategy, and any organization that is serious about extracting value from data, and more importantly, being able to use that value at an organization or a business level. Now, it's interesting. We have seen a lot of change. I mean, change is one of the key things. And I think I don't really want to talk about pandemics, et cetera, because this is something, it's another problem that we're all having to deal with. But one of the key factors in IT today is that there's more change going on than there's ever been. And we can see a shift now. There's no argument whether IT is a utility model or not. This is the way the industry is moving. And it's difficult for the Middle East, where we have certain limitations on availability of cloud infrastructures, where we have rules around data sovereignty, et cetera. But the reality is that the industry is moving in one direction, and that direction is really around cloud, whether that's private or public cloud. But the key thing there is that most of the innovation, if not all of the innovation, is coming within these more agile and more scalable IT infrastructures. So within the Middle East, there is a limitation because there's a dependency on the availability of cloud infrastructures. Now, at the moment, we see the two big investors as being AWS and Azure. We do see instances of Alibaba. We've seen some movement on Google. But this is a key factor because without a cloud policy and without security controls being in place, it's very difficult for either private companies or public companies to adopt the required infrastructures to support digital strategies, etc., without accessing the cloud. But the important thing there is that for most people, this is looking at confidential information. But the value of data is shifting now. And for most organizations that adopt digital strategies, there's a realization that the valuable data that they need is not data in their own organization, which is often limited, and as I mentioned before, is normally time-bound, but the useful information is actually external to the company. And it's interesting that we see again in the US, there's a large drive towards data brokerage, and we're seeing more and more organizations that create value from data being in a position where they can either monetize or trade that data or exchange data, either with suppliers, customers, or in certain cases, competitors. So if we look at the current pandemic at the moment, we're seeing a lot of collaboration with pharmaceutical companies that are prepared to share information on clinical trials, et cetera, which in the past has not really been possible or was not accepted. But again, if you look at what's happened in the last few months globally, the companies that have adapted best to the pandemic have always been the ones that have had a digital strategy, or they're using agile IT infrastructures. And I always use the example of my local AWS. or Amazon. Amazon have always delivered next day. It's not been an issue. But very quickly, because of demands on supply chains, with people's buying habits changing quickly, with the development of perishable goods now within the supply chain, I can now order on Amazon in the morning and they will deliver to me in the afternoon. And they did that extremely quickly. And they did it because they had in advance not just the infrastructure, but the agility at an IT level and also at a people level. They had the agility to be able to adapt to market changes and be able to change their business model to meet their customer demands. Another example in the Middle East, we have one customer that is federal tax. And federal tax adopted Talend late last year because, again, what's happening with the pandemic, and particularly in this particular country where travel and tourism is a big part of income, the ability to be able to collect taxes more effectively and to be able to change the taxation rules, either short-term to reduce them to encourage more tourism or to increase them to actually collect more monies. This organization, because they had a digital platform and because they had a data management platform like Talend, were able to change their taxation rules and be able to apply that within weeks and not typically the months and years that it would have taken before. So markets and environments have changed overnight. You have to be lean and agile. And today, because the world is getting smaller with globalization, customers demand instant and customized experiences. So data management adoption in the Middle East. I mentioned before that there are some limitations, and one of the limitations that a lot of people are overcoming is access to the cloud, is the issues around data sovereignty, are the concerns around security. But typically, most of the projects that we're seeing today are really still focused on the prerequisites of a digital strategy, which effectively is data integration, where an organization can connect to all of the various data sources that it has internally and be able to transform that data to the various targets that they have, whether it's other applications, databases, data visualization tools, etc., etc. But very quickly, after an organization has established more connectivity internally and the ability to be able to access that data and build not just data warehouses, but data lakes, etc., then the focus moves very, very quickly to data quality. So we're seeing a lot more initiatives around data quality because data quality suddenly becomes more critical when the consequences of using that data become much more mission critical. So as I said earlier, if you were running a traditional business intelligence report that was running a dashboard or a KPI, these were pretty much indicators. They were running on historic data. But if that data now is helping you make day-to-day business decisions, then that data has to be correct because the consequences of getting it wrong hit the organization real time, and the impacts can be quite severe, both from a positive and also from a negative perspective. We are seeing an increase in cloud availability. There's obviously a limitation. Not all applications move to the cloud. A lot of organizations are still in a legacy environment, but it's happening. And as I say, the battle that we see is really between AWS and primarily Azure. But again, looking at the US experience, what is happening there, and I'm seeing it in Europe, is that not only do organizations have a cloud strategy, but they also have a multi-cloud strategy. And one of the concerns about an organization like AWS is that Amazon itself is a competitor to a lot of those organizations. They're probably one of the strongest global retailers now, So some customers are uncomfortable using the technology and having dependence on the technology from an organization that becomes a competitor. But that goes further. So even if we look at banking, some of the real challenges to banking now are the IT companies themselves. So when you look again at Amazon, when we look at PayPal, when we look at Apple Pay, these are banking solutions or financial solutions that didn't come from traditional banking and financial institutions. These are technology companies that have adopted technology, and consumers are trusting them. And consumers are moving more and more now to digital transactions, and they're quite happy to use the vendors of those IT products to conduct fairly sensitive and fairly important transactions for them. So we're seeing a lot of change there. And the other point is really around digital transformation. And again, if I look around the Middle East, particularly if I look at Saudi as an example, Saudi is a very large company, both their country, both geographically and by population. It has a very young population, but it had a very high dependency on oil and gas. What we're seeing now is an initiative at a government level that we're seeing right the way across GCC, where countries are having to develop digital strategies. And the consequences are that they're trying to attract new revenues, new economics into the country, be it on smart cities or on free zones or trading platforms, etc., etc. But one of the drawbacks that we still see is that there's still a lack of skill in the Middle East. And it's not just skill. I mean, we can look at training, but you have to couple training with experience. So obviously, for a lot of organizations, having access to a digital platform at an early stage is important, because it not only gives them access to the technology, but it enables them to use the technology and to build new competencies. And this is something that organizations need when they follow digital strategies. So if we look at a typical company today, and this is a very US-centric slide, and I apologize, but what it's saying, and it's probably true in a big organization, most organizations, and this is just a report, it shows that a typical organization has 400 sources of data. They've probably got 6 tools that they've been using for data management. They have operational issues because of bad data, and they've probably tried digital transformation, and it's either failed or not been as successful as they expected. So it's not an easy thing to do. So although accessing technology in theory is something that just can be acquired, the success in all of this is having the ability, to choose the right platform, and the platform needs to be strategic, but also to have a platform that effectively is easy to use, that it doesn't have a high dependency on roles such as data scientists that are very much in short supply. It needs to be very easy to use, very intuitive. And again, particularly in the Middle East, it doesn't have to come with a high dependency on programming skills like Java and Spark, etc. So Talend ticks all of the boxes when you start to look at digital platforms, digital data platforms, and looking at how best they can be adopted, particularly in the Middle East, where we're seeing a combination of on-premise and cloud-type solutions, and where we're seeing a limitation on the right level of skills that are required to use these products. So if we get a little bit closer to home, and I'm nearly finished now, I'm going to hand over to Luca, that's going to do much more of a technical deep dive on this. But when we look at data in an organization, and remember, data to us is structured and it's unstructured data. It's IoT, it's video, it's web services, etc., etc. But It's interesting again, and if I look at the Middle East as an example, and there's always a lag. But what we see, particularly in the bigger organizations in the US and some parts of Europe, is that the successful match between IT and the business is not as strong, as mature as we would expect and as people would like. So it's important now when we look at data, and data is something that is a common commodity that's really owned by the organization. Data quality is not the responsibility of IT. Data quality is the responsibility of the business. But effectively, when we look at data and we look at the internal consumers and we look at the parts of the organization that are dependent on rich data, accurate data, et cetera, it extends right the way through the organization. And on this particular slide, it's calling out the traditional purchasing departments, sales departments, senior management, developers, data architects, et cetera. So everybody is a stakeholder in this. And it's interesting that from a talent perspective, and again, looking at the Middle East, we're seeing more and more of a shift when people are looking at data management platforms. In the past, we probably would have looked at this from a technical perspective, and we probably would have run a fairly detailed and complex POC. But now the shift is to proof of value. And typically the sponsors and the stakeholders that we're dealing with on data management platforms and digital strategies, et cetera, is not IT. IT are at the table, but typically the lead there is the business, or more and more now in bigger and more mature organizations, it's either the chief data officer or the chief digital officer. So IT has a job here, and there's a frustration for IT that we see. Today, the role of IT is to keep the lights on, is to keep the business running. But at the same time, they're under pressure from the business to deliver these agile platforms. And the danger is that if IT doesn't deliver those platforms, then with the availability of cloud, the business themselves can go out and they can build and acquire highly available and complex data management platforms using AWS or Azure or Alibaba or whatever, without being a vSphere Hyper-V expert, but effectively just being in a position where they can pay a bill and use a very simple drag and drop GUI to be able to build complex IT infrastructures. And this is something that organizations need to avoid. But we are starting to see this in the Middle East, where shadow IT, if IT can't deliver the infrastructure, then the business can go out and acquire it. So, conscious of time, this is sort of summarizing what I think I've been saying. So, when we talk about data chaos, when we talk about the availability and the challenges of data, at the end of the day, it's all to do with business outcomes. Whether you're a government organization, whether you're federal tax or Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Ministry of Health, et cetera, everything is to do with business outcomes. But you have to get data integration right. Once you've got the integration right, you're going to look at data quality. Data governance suddenly becomes important. And then the other key factor when we look at data maturity is that it's not always about the data, but it's data about the data. So when we start looking at metadata management and we look at the requirements around understanding data lineage, et cetera, then this moves the requirements to another level where, as I say, it's not just around the data itself, but business decisions and the auditing of business decisions are based on the data lineage. And also for an organization to be able to scan their entire architecture and to identify all of the various data sources that they have as an organization, and to be able to make sure that the consumers of data are getting it from the right sources. So to summarize then, there's a lot of dynamics going on. We've seen a lot of organizations in the Middle East being very successful. We've seen some very innovative projects that have happened. From my perspective, interestingly enough, more and more in government, and we're seeing government transform not as quickly as we'd like, but the transformation is there. But certainly with quasi-government and with private sector organizations, sometimes driven by market conditions and sometimes driven by change agents, such as the appointment of a chief digital officer or a chief data officer, we're starting to see this really take traction now. But the important thing is that we've got some history. We know that the US particularly and some parts of Europe are much more advanced. And that knowledge and that experience can be shared to try and enable localized projects to benefit from that and for these projects to be successful for the people that are making the investments. So behind all of this is the need, as I say, there's the infrastructure requirements, but because data becomes strategic, then data management requires a strategic data management platform. And this is what we're just going to give you a very simple glimpse into. On this call, we've got a combination of technical people, deep technical people, and probably not so technical people. So I apologize in advance. For some, it might be too detailed. For others, it might not be detailed enough. But if there is an interest and if people want to know more, we can always run more sessions, or we can run a customized session, or just respond to any questions that you may have. So, Luca, I'm going to get ready to hand over to you. I don't know if you want to share your screen, or do you want to?
Yeah, please. If you can stop sharing, I can start sharing mine.
Okay. Right. Hopefully you should have control.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, can you see my screen?
No. Oh, we can now.
All right. So, what Brian was talking about is data chaos. And data chaos, the word chaos evokes in our mind the image of some kind of disorder where we want to put order. And so, and in order to do that, we need a strategic data management platform, as the last slide of Brian. So right now, what I would like to show you is how a strategic data management platform can help you in a real scenario in order to put order where there's disorder. And in order to do that, I will use an example of, let's say, a fake company called Acme Company that has customer information across different systems and want to create one single source of truth of customers. So some kind of, so it's a requirement that traditionally was referred as a master data management requirement. Now we prefer, according to also the latest recommendations of Gartner, to defining more an MDM data hub requirement. Now, in order to understand how to approach such a problem, it's a good practice to divide, to identify the main phases of what we define a data pipeline. So the first phase is, of course, the collection phase, where we collect data from different sources. Can be internal, external, structured, unstructured, databases, cloud, and so on and so forth. So in our scenario, this is actually the graphical representation of a job that is implemented within the Talend platform. You can see that the first phase is the collection of data from different sources, the Salesforce, Twitter, and Market. And Talend, the platform, provides more than 1,000 between connectors and components in order to do that. Now, the second phase of the data pipeline is the governance phase, and the governance can have different meanings. So let's start from the first one. The first one is giving the evidence of the data quality of your data. Okay, and so in order to do that, what you need to do is for sure profiling the data. And actually, within the platform, there are different ways of doing this. So this is just one of them, where you have the columns of the data that you want to profile. Here you have some indicators, and checking and unchecking the indicators, you create some profiling analysis, where basically you want to measure what the quality is and what are the next actions that you want to apply to your data in order to enhance the data quality. So once you have the data quality analysis and reports in place, you might want to prepare your data. So you might need a tool that allows you to create rules that will somehow solve those issues that have been identified running the data quality analysis. And in this case, this is called the data preparation portal, where users that are even not necessarily developers can, in a graphical way, creating this set of rules that will be applied to the data. So collection, profiling, and the creation of preparation rules. Then the next phase of a data pipeline is the transformation. And the transformation can mean different things, because it can mean, for example, applying the data preparation rules that we just created, can mean also, and means actually, also the mapping of the different schemas that you have coming from the different sources to the final schema of our, let's define it, golden table. So what we can define the common data model. And then last but not least, we want, for example, in this scenario, to implement some automatic rules in order to create an exact and probabilistic deduplication of the records. Okay. And in order to do that, we have different parts. So we have the data preparation, this data preparation component that is the one that actually executes the rules, the preparation rules that we just created. We have some transformation components for mapping the different formats that are coming from the different sources to our common data model, so to the schema that will be the final schema of our table that contains our single source of truth of customers. And then we have also here, and this is just one of our many components that are part of the data quality set, that actually applies some exact and probabilistic rules that we set within the component itself in order to deduplicate with a certain level of confidence in an automatic way the customer records. Okay. Now, let's say that we set a level of confidence here. And in the, if the grouping that happens with this component reaches the specific level of confidence, we are writing it directly in our single source of truth. But actually, what happens for the other records? For the other records, we want to involve humans, so we want a human intervention for deduplicating the records in a manual way where the machine wasn't able to deduplicate them with a level of confidence that was enough for us. And so in order to do that, we want to involve what we call the stewards. The stewards are basically people that usually belong to the business department and that are accountable for actions that are happening on the data. Before doing this, we want to mask them. Okay, so we want to, since let's say that these data are, they have a personal identifiable information, we are under GDPR compliance, and so we want to mask some personal identifiable information to the stewards before sending them. Then, and here for this reason, we are talking about a second part of the governance, because it can be seen as part of the governance. What the stewards can do at this point, using a specific portal where you can see here I'm asked two fields, the email field and the phone number field. But what they can do basically is having the different sources that are contributing for the creation of the single golden record. They can promote the values of the different fields coming from the different sources to the golden record. Then they can validate, at this point, they can validate what they did so far. And then at this point, you can see that the end-to-end for creation of a single source of truth is completed. And just to recap, we collected the data, we profiled some of the data. Based on the profiling, we created some rules that we call data preparations. Then we applied the transformations that we wanted. That means applying these rules that we just created, mapping the different formats to our common data model, and also applying some automatic deduplication policies. And then for all those records, so for all, let's call them exceptions that happened, we wanted to involve the stewards. We masked some data, we sent this data to the stewards, and manually they duplicated all those records. So let's say that right now we have a single source of truth in place. But what are we doing with that? I mean, are we simply inspecting the data with some reports? Or, for example, we want to use this single source of truth as an operational base, database for actually for cooperating, for actually being integrated with the other applications that we might have in our environment. And this is actually where the sharing phase comes. Because actually, once we have the data by definition is an information container, okay? And so there can be, we want actually to prepare it, and so we want to make it available to the different kinds of consumers that we can have. And an example of sharing can be creating REST APIs around your data. Okay, so basically creating a service layer around your data that will allow other applications to interact with. And actually here you can see that, I mean, also here, this is, we're using the Talend platform. We have some very easy way of implementing graphically any kind of REST API that we might need. So we created a single source of truth. We share the data across the different systems. REST API is just one. The sharing phase can be also, for example, transforming the data and writing it into a data mart that will be interrogated by a business intelligence tool. Okay, so it's a generic concept. But so we create the single source of truth. We prepared it in order to be shared. And now, what is the last part of the governance? The last part of the governance, we call it here metadata management, because actually what happens is that the more systems and environments get complex, and the more it's difficult for who is accountable for what's going on. Imagine the CDO of a company, for example. The CDO of a company needs to understand how the system looks like, for example. So what is the holistic view of a system? Imagine that you have 400 different sources and different levels of transformations that end up in in hundreds of reports that are produced by different lines of business across the world, for example. I mean, a CDO needs to have the visibility of what's going on. And this is not the only question that he needs to understand. This is why a metadata management tool comes into the games. And this is an example of an holistic view that is taken from our Talend data catalog, and that shows you basically the different processes. So here, for example, you can see that we have some talent jobs. We have some we have also some the target tables, the source tables, and so on and so forth. So let's say that here you can see that you have a single view of what's going on. A second part that is even more critical is the question that the CDO can have, for example, inspecting a report. Okay, but why this value in this dimension of the report is always wrong? Where this data is coming from? What are the transformations that happen in order to produce the data that is in this dimension? Who is accountable for that? Instead of, let's say that before having this kind of tools, this kind of metadata management tools, what happened was that the CDO had to pick up the phone, calling someone that knew that it was someone else that had the responsibility, and so on and so forth, losing an enormous amount of time. And time is money. And not only, and this kind of activity, so let's say based, that relies only on the knowledge of people, in many cases ended up also to mistakes. And if there was a personally identifiable information that was exposed where it shouldn't have been exposed, that might create big problems. So there is the concept of lineage. That means actually understanding, starting from one position of the data, in this case, for example, is the email field in our single source of truth, understanding what's going on, going backwards. Okay, and here in the tool you can drill down at every single level. For example, here highlighting this line, there is the possibility here, there is a part that is not shown in this line, but actually there is the possibility, it tells you what is exactly the talent job that executed, that is performing the transformation from which the field comes. And also you can drill down at the level of every single transformation of the talent job. So actually the lineage that is in this case is a backward lineage, can be also a forward lineage. For example, when the IT needs to understand what is the impact if I remove the email field. I mean, what is the impact if I change this field from numbers to string? And this is actually where the lineage can be absolutely needed and useful for a company. Now, just a little bracket that I want to open. There is also the possibility for every kind of metadata, and metadata can be a table, can be a database, can be the field of a table, and so on and so forth. There is also the possibility of creating, alerting, recommending, certifying the data. And this comes more and more important, especially when it comes also to what we call the data monetization. So when you want actually to certify your data in order to sell it, for example, or even, and it doesn't have to be just a physical monetization with money. It can be also selling internally when for example, there is the result of merge and acquisitions, and there are two systems that are in competitions, and you need to understand which one will survive and which one won't. So, I mean, this is one over many different cases that can be there. Then, another need, always talking about, for example, merger and acquisitions, but also when we are talking about large companies that have different lines of business. Many times, a big problem in the company is the terminology, because sometimes there is one guy from the operational department, for example, that is talking about address. And for address, he or she means the address of a customer. While on the other hand, the finance department, when they talk about address, they are referring to an invoicing address. So you can see that the same can mean different things. This is why more and more companies want to define glossaries in terminologies in order to have a common meaning to the different terminology. And this is why in a metadata management tool, what you can do together with harvesting the different metadata in order to have the holistic view, to perform a lineage and all the things that I showed you, is also to enrich these metadata with other, let's call them even metadata. And enriching them can be, for example, defining a glossary. Here, a glossary is a collection of categories, okay, where every category can have or other categories inside or other terms. And in this way, you can create what is referred as a taxonomy. Once you have a glossary in place, okay, so once you define all your terminology, what you can do within the tool is mapping a specific term with a specific metadata that you might have. So, for example, if we defined the email address as a term, we can create what we call a semantic mapping between this term and the field that we have on the database. For example, in our single source of truth. And in this way, thanks to that, we can do something that is very powerful, that is called semantic lineage. And actually, the semantic lineage is the data lineage enhanced with also the semantic information, starting actually from the semantic information. So in this case, for example, what we are doing here, we have a glossary that is called finance, where we have a category that is called the GDPR, and in our category GDPR, we have the email address. And what we did so far was binding the email address to the email field of our single source of truth. And with one single click, performing what is called the semantic lineage, the CDO can answer to complex questions like, what is the impact of GDPR over my environment? So simply putting here GDPR in this, that is a full text search over all the metadata, the CDO can check which are what is the definition of GDPR, can check, for example, the personally identifiable information, and then pressing another button can create the semantic flow of the personally identifiable information, being able actually to see what is the practical impact of GDPR over a system that, I repeat, can be extremely, extremely complex. So this is why a metadata management tool completes the governance part. So you can see that in general, and I wrap up and I leave the word to Wasim and Stephanie. So just to recap, when we have data chaos, we need to put order in the chaos. And in order to do that, we need a strategic data management platform. And what I showed you so far is actually how you can leverage one strategic data management platform. Here, of course, is Talend, because I work for Talend, but this is a generic concept that you can find with different flavors, of course, on different platforms. But actually, when we are talking about a data management platform and a data management use case, we mostly have the four phases of collection, governance, transformation, and the sharing. And once you have all these concepts clear, I think that is really up to your imagination how to solve any business case that can pop up to you with a strategic data management platform like Talend in our case. All right, so I think that I can leave the word to Wasim. I hope that I wasn't too long.
Thanks a lot, Luca. There was a slide at the end of the presentation. Can you, or let me share it from my end?
Yes, please. Oh, sorry, yes, because I thought that you wanted to share it.
No worries, no worries. It's just one slide. I just need to talk about it for 2 or 3 minutes, that's all.
Yeah.
I'll share my screen. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is one last slide in the presentation. I just needed to talk a bit about one of our success stories with one of our biggest clients, EDF, Électricité de France, where we have deployed a data management solution. EDF is the French electric utility company owned by the French state, and it provides more than 120 gigawatts of generation capacity in Europe, North America, Asia, and some other regions. In 2016, we have been awarded to implement one big project for EDF, consisting on a full data management solution, starting by the data ingestion and ending up by an archiving solution with one of our Intalio products. The integration and data capture was done from multiple sources. Some of them were structured and others unstructured, such as some documents from their document management system. We have prepared, after the ingestion and the capture, we have prepared the acquired data and applied some transformation rules, including data application and data cleansing, in order to archive part of it and keep the other part in the data warehouse. The size of data was huge. That's why we have deployed HBase and HDFS cluster, which is a sub-project of Hadoop, the big data solution, under a distributed architecture framework that allows the management of these large documents. And additionally, we have installed SOAR engine for the indexing of the metadata of these documents. Here we are giving some insights as well about the volume of the data and documents processed and archived within this solution. We are talking about around 1 million documents captured on a daily basis, 60,000 documents stored daily, around 1.5 million documents consulted between the teams and the departments, internally and externally, definitely. The system is currently able to handle around 3,000 simultaneous access with a response time less than 3 seconds. Where actually we have a really powerful solution, and it's highly available and scalable, definitely. So I just like to add this case study to give the attendees some idea about one of our deployments in this context, the data management. I don't know if you would like to add anything, Luca or Brian, before taking the question of the attendees.
Not from me.
Yeah, not
okay.
from me.
Okay. Let me check. What do we have? Okay. Someone is asking, I want to ask, is Talend based on subscription, and do you have community version? Does the solution support on-premises and the cloud deployments?
So sorry, it's Brian. If I take that question. So Talend is just based on subscription. So one of the key things with Talend is there's no what we call data tax. So on a subscription model per developer, everything is out of the box. So all of the connectors, and we don't charge for nodes or CPUs or data types or data volumes, etc., etc. The other thing is that the Talend Data Fabric product is both on-prem stroke in cloud and also in hybrid. So it really operates within the customer's infrastructure. And the same applies to the SaaS version, where Talend will host the instance of Talend and maintain the Talend on behalf of the customer. But the key thing to mention is that all of the data flows, all of the jobs that are created are all executed within the customer's environment. So with the exception of cloud to cloud, data never passes to Talend. So Talend, the main components of Talend is actually the developer studio, where the job that Luca was demonstrating is designed. But once a job is designed, the execution is actually done in the customer's environment, and the administration is done by a Talend administration server. So hopefully that answered the question. I think I caught all of them.
Yes, sure. Another question, we frequently hear about data pipeline. My question to you is, what does it have to do with the data integration? Are they similar?
Yeah, probably I can take this. This is a clear example of terminology that I was mentioning before. So, since actually data pipeline is a word like cloud, so that is used in different ways. What I suggest, at least this is my personal way of seeing this. The data pipeline represents the list of different phases that data needs to pass in order to have information extracted from it. So a data pipeline can be seen in this way. Of course, data integration at this point is a part of the data pipeline, but it's not only that. As I said, there are different phases. No, the collection phase can be seen as strictly related to the data integration part. But actually, we have also the governance. We have also the sharing part. The transformation phase can be seen also part of the integration phase. So let's say that mostly the data pipeline is just a list of phases that data needs to pass through, and that allows us to extract information from it, because data, let's not forget, that can be seen as a container of information. I will also profit to answer to the next question, because here there is the next question where they're asking, hello, can you please state the main difference between ETL and ENT?
Yes, Luca, and I would like to add one thing for this question as well. If you can give us a use case for each one, so we can everyone can really understand the difference between ETL and DLT. Let's have a small use case or example.
Absolutely. No, I will give it to you. So let's say that you want to move data from your sources to Snowflake. I don't know if you are familiar with Snowflake, but Snowflake is, let's say, a SaaS-based data warehouse. Okay. At this point, you have your sources, and you need to transform these sources, okay, because you need to, they have different formats, and you want to correlate them. At this point, you have two options to do that. Or while you extract the data, you perform some transformations, and then you write them into Snowflake, okay? And this is one option, and this is ETL, because extract first, transform second, and load, so write to the target. This is the ETL way. But on the other hand, I mentioned the Snowflake, because the Snowflake has some optimized functions that perform fast transformations. So in this case, it might be useful, and this is one use case, I will tell you also the second one. It might be useful, instead of transforming the data before writing them into Snowflake, it would be more performant, taking all the data, writing the data as is in Snowflake, and then performing the transformations in the Snowflake itself using their internal functions. Okay, this is one scenario. A second scenario can be, for example, when you're talking about machine learning. Let's say that you have many different sources that you correlate with each other. Okay, and you want to actually train a machine learning model. In order to do that, probably you don't want to use, let's say, standard technologies. Probably you want to rely on big data processing. So you want, for example, to have a Spark cluster executing the machine learning algorithms. In this case, an ELT approach can be useful, because what can be done is writing everything in, let's say, a data warehouse or a data lake or whatever. And then once everything has been loaded, then applying let's call them transformations, that is in our case, for example, the machine learning algorithm, okay, that is actually training your machine. And also this can be seen as an ELT scenario, where you first load all the data into your data lake, and then you apply some advanced techniques for processing that. So it depends, basically. The choice it relies on what is the most performant and most, at the end, cost-effective system that will perform the transformation. I hope I answered to the question.
Okay, there is no more questions. Okay, I guess there is no more questions. Thanks, Brian and Luca, for this presentation and demo. Thanks, everyone, for your participation, and hopefully we are going to see you in our next webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.